Do you ever catch yourself saying, English is just crazy? Maybe your students come across a tricky word and you tell them, you just have to memorize that one, or this is the part you have to know by heart. But deep down, you know it's still confusing. Here's the truth. English isn't random. It's a wonderfully complex system, and once you understand how that system works, through sound, structure, and meaning, everything changes. That's what Sarah, Paul, and I teach inside Mastering Morphology. This isn't another curriculum. It's deep teacher knowledge inside a practical, comprehensive course that finally shows you how words really work. No more exceptions, no more gimmicks or patching holes with memorization or phonics alone. It's time to go beyond sound it out and give your students the framework they need to truly understand words. So if you're ready to stop guessing and start teaching with confidence, join us inside Mastering Morphology. Enrollment is open now, so we invite you to click the link in the show notes to get started. You're listening to episode 89 of Literacy in Color. Today's episode is such a powerful conversation, especially if you've ever felt like your students can perhaps decode, but aren't quite becoming fluent readers. I'm joined by Dr. Melissa Orkin and Sarah Gannon of Crafting Minds Group, who are also co-authors of the Structured Literacy Playbook, along with Alexandria Osborne. Dr. Orkin is a developmental psychologist who trained under Dr. Maryanne Wolf at Tufts University's Center for Reading and Language Research, where she specialized in learning disabilities and achievement motivation. She now works with schools and educators to translate reading science into practice. Sarah Gannon is a former classroom teacher, reading specialist, ESL teacher, and literacy coach with nearly 2 decades of experience. She's Orton Gillingham trained and brings a deeply practical classroom-centered lens to bridging research and instruction. In this episode, we dive into their backward planning approach to structured literacy, the POSSUM Framework, high-leverage instructional routines that build fluency, and what it really takes to move students from accurate decoding to meaningful, fluent reading. Welcome to the Literacy in Color podcast. I'm your host, Michelle Sullivan, a science of reading advocate with over a decade of experience as a reading interventionist and literacy coach. I'm passionate about making evidence-based instruction both effective and engaging. If you're interested in captivating our learners on reading fluently and understanding language, or as I like to call it, keeping it colorful, then you've found the right place. Each week, we'll explore intriguing lit bits and practical strategies around the science of reading and structured literacy to help you be colorful and teach colorfully. Are you ready to bring literacy to life? Let's color outside the lines and make an impact together. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Literacy in Color. I am so delighted to be joined by Melissa Orkin and Sarah Gannon of Crafting Minds today, and we are going to be talking about their latest book, the Structured Literacy Playbook. So before we get started, I just want to welcome you to the show, and maybe we can start out with a brief introduction and sharing your backgrounds in this literacy space. I know, Melissa, you are like the protege of Dr. Maryanne Wolf, which is so exciting. She's so brilliant. So maybe you guys can share a little bit about what brought you to the current space you're in.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having us, Michelle. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Dr. Wolf would say I'm her protege. I'm definitely riding her coattails, but she was my advisor at Tufts. I worked for a long time as a program director at her Center for Reading and Language Research at Tufts University, which is a university just outside of Boston. That's where I did my doctoral work and taught some courses as well on learning disabilities. And I began as an interventionist and found in my work in the field that there was a real challenge around bringing children to fluent levels of reading and supporting their comprehension with fluency. And so I sought out working with Dr. Wolf because she was really focused on that area of research and curriculum development. And that seemed like the perfect combination. So her work is largely with students with dyslexia, students who have a unique challenge with fluency due to retrieval challenges. But in working at the center, I found that so many of her strategies were applicable to children who maybe didn't meet the criteria for dyslexia, but needed more support than just the core curriculum could provide. So now as a practitioner and a consultant with Sarah through Crafting Minds, we work with school districts and the Department of Education and thinking about strategies for supporting fluency development.
Great. And nice to be here, Michelle. And I was a former classroom teacher, reading specialist, literacy coach. And then I left the field not too long ago and became certified at associate's level for Orkin Gillingham. And I had a small private practice. It really came from supporting my own daughter who was diagnosed with dyslexia. And I met Melissa. Maybe I'm Melissa's protege. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
I met Melissa when she came to speak to my school, and I was really impressed with the ability to translate the research to practice. And I felt like that was something that was just missing for a lot of professional development folks that I'd seen speak. It's like taking what you know to be true and what works in the research labs, but really, how does this boil down to the people in the classroom tomorrow? And so that's something that really spoke to me. And her commitment to fluency and has opened my eyes to really understanding what fluency is. How does it broaden the original definition, I came away with for fluency? And how do I plan lessons that support students in that journey to become automatic across all of those processes? So I think that's what I'm proud of, and have joined Melissa at Crafting Minds and really working with teachers at the school level, the district level, and also the state level.
I love that. And I had the pleasure of hearing you, Sarah, speak in person in New York at the Summer Symposium for the Reading League. And that's one thing that I appreciate about the work that you guys do is you do take this deep research and this important information, and both of you have a wonderful way of synthesizing that to make it practitioner friendly. And what will this actually look like in my classroom? How do I apply the science of reading in a structured literacy framework, which actually brings us to the Structured Literacy Playbook. So maybe you can share how that book was born and what kind of inspired you to put that book together.
When I think about the presentation at the Reading League, and I think about a lot of our presentations that we talk about, fluency really is at the heart of the discussion. But this book was written to really address students who are at risk for reading difficulties or who maybe need a slightly differentiated approach. So it's thinking about students who are at risk and who would benefit from a small group for reading instruction. And again, the emphasis really is on fluency. And we unpack that in the book. And I think Melissa will probably share a little bit more about that when she talks a little bit more about Maryanne Wolf and the POSSUM approach. But at the very heart of the book, and for each of the different chapters, is having the text, the decodable text that aligns with the students' skill level and their phase of word recognition. And that was very intentional because for a lot of students we work with and students I've worked with in my practice, it's important to understand what skill do they have? What do I need to teach them to move them into the next phase? So I maybe have students who at the very beginning level of reading maybe know some of their letters and sounds, but they're having difficulty moving to blending. So how can I support students in that way? And so the early chapter focuses on a winning strategy for continuous blending. And we take that framework by creating a lesson from a decodable text. Each chapter supports that. And then we highlight the different winning strategies, which are really just high leverage instructional routines that are supported by research that help students move through those phases of word recognition. So it was trying to help teachers kind of not block out the noise, but I think they're surrounded with a lot of curricula. They're surrounded with a lot of resources. There's a lot to take in. There's a lot to consider. And if they were like me and my background, I didn't have the sort of skill level to know how to implement structured literacy before I received any specialized training. I think you were talking earlier, your approach maybe was a little different, Michelle. But for a lot of teachers, they come out of school and they don't have the bandwidth or the skills from their program to be able to take what it is that's critical to reading instruction and plan targeted small group lessons. And so that was really the impetus for the book.
That's great. And I love how you keep referencing fluency as this critical component that you wanted to emphasize, because often in the science of reading movement, phonics is taking center stage, and rightfully so. That is an area that we've been lacking nationally for a really long time. But how do we move from that word level to this fluent reading, which ultimately is that bridge to comprehension? And I think that's where a lot of teachers get stuck. So I think your book is a really helpful resource in helping teachers understand how to frame their instruction to put fluency at the forefront, to say, you know, this is what we're working towards to become more fluent readers. And when we think about this idea of structured literacy, it can be used as this term that's thrown around, but why is it really essential to how the reading brain is operating?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it all goes back to the idea that reading is unnatural. So we're not born to read. We don't have a gene. We don't have a single neuron that is designed for reading. And this is in opposition to language acquisition. So acquiring oral language is very natural. We have genes that are uniquely designed to process language. They sit right in the part of our brain, right near our ear. It's all very incredibly orchestrated so that if a young child or an infant is, et cetera, is in a language-rich environment, they will process that language. But the same is not true for reading. So because it is unnatural, we know that all individuals need some level of instruction to acquire the code for written language. That level of instruction varies in intensity kind of along a continuum. And we know that individuals with dyslexia require the most intensive form of instruction. And the type of instruction that we provide can either enhance the process and ensure that it's as efficient as possible, or it can sort of delay or impede the acquisition of skills. And so reading is the most studied aspect of learning. It's thought of as sort of the building block of all other achievement. And throughout the last 50 years plus, going all the way back to like the 1950s, we have a body of research and data that's been compiled on effective forms of reading instruction. And in the last 10 years or so, that's all been consolidated down into what has now been called structured literacy instruction. And so what structured literacy instruction delineates is the content of what should be taught to help build the reading circuit in the brain and the delivery system by which that information should be kind of conveyed to a student. So it's both. It's both the content and the delivery.
Yeah. And I appreciate you tipping your hat towards that varying intensity piece and instruction. And critics of structured literacy will say, well, I had students reading with a different type of approach, like balanced literacy or a whole language. And those students are likely just the ones that would have read without any type of
Exactly, Michelle. Exactly. Just like with any skill, individuals are going to fall along a continuum of necessitating different levels of support or instruction. But there are always going to be those students who come into first grade holding Harry Potter and can begin to decode some of those terms in Harry Potter. But I would say that is the minority of students, and the majority of students need some level of instruction. And then students who meet the criteria for dyslexia require the most intensive.
Yeah, 100%. And then you already referenced Dr. Maryanne Wolf's POSSUM acronym, and I'm sure that can be an episode all on its own, but maybe you can briefly just explain the different components of the acronym and how that assists in integrating all those multiple
Sure.
aspects of word level knowledge?
Yeah. So as I mentioned earlier, I began working with Dr. Wolf because she was studying fluency development among students with dyslexia. And what she found with this population, and I think what resonates with a lot of educators, is many children who have been diagnosed with a specific learning disability or who are receiving additional support, maybe tier 2 intervention, often make good progress with their decoding skills given the instruction, but that it doesn't always translate into fluency development. And so she was really trying to unpack why that was. And what she discovered in part was that it had to do with the retrieval process. And so retrieval is one of the big cognitive skills that contributes to reading. We largely think of them as retrieval, working memory, language, comprehension, phonological ability. And retrieval in particular is going to, take what we know and help us bring it forward to use it. So when we, see a word in print, we're able to pronounce that word. We're able to retrieve the meaning of that word. We're able to understand the meaning of a sentence based on what we know about parts of speech, etc. And she found that there were individuals, many of whom were diagnosed with dyslexia, who had these kind of underlying weaknesses in retrieval. Their retrieval skills were far below the average of a typical reader. And rather than providing just additional phonics instruction with these individuals, she looked to sort of the neuroscience of reading to understand, well, what do fluent readers do? How does their retrieval work? And how can we replicate that experience for students with dyslexia? And many of her insights were brought about by looking at the different areas of the reading circuit that are activated when a fluent reader is reading. So we know all of this from the amazing neuroimaging work that's been done to better understand what the brain activation processes look like as different types of readers are reading text. And she found that when a fluent reader is reading, they activate different parts of their reading circuit that recruit information about the meaning of words, about parts of speech, about the sounds of language, about connecting sounds to the symbol. And so she developed this acronym POSSUM to represent all the parts of the reading circuit that are activated during reading. So POSSUM, the P in POSSUM stands for phonology. So that's everything we know about the sounds of language. So part of the brain in the temporal lobe lights up when we are thinking about sounds. The O stands for orthography. So that's how we spell the sounds with letters. So for example, in English, we can spell the sound E in many different ways. We can spell it with just an E, an EE, an EY, etc. So that area of the brain is called the visual word form area. That's where we're connecting letters and sounds. Then there's the part of the brain that activates during meaning. So the first S in POSSUM stands for semantics. That's where we're retrieving all the information about word meanings. The second S stands for syntax. That's parts of speech. So thinking about whether in a sentence the word is serving as a noun, as a verb, as an adjective. And then the M in POSSUM stands for morphology. So that is root affects. And what she found is that if we start to develop curricula that teach strategies across all the elements of POSSUM in a given lesson. So this is a very connectivist approach where we're not saying this is our phonics time, this is our vocabulary time. Rather, we're saying in a given lesson, we're going to connect sounds to letters, to meaning, to parts of speech, to morphology when it's appropriate. That students began to grow in their fluency compared to when they just received decoding instruction alone. And so she packaged that strategic approach as a curriculum called RAVO. And RAVO is still available today. In fact, it was recently revised and expanded. And it's really designed for students who have been identified with a specific learning disability, including dyslexia, and have the need for this more specialized instruction in fluency development. what we did was we took the POSSUM approach and we made it applicable to any child, but at the front of mind, we had the students who are not developing their fluency skills in your classroom, who maybe don't meet the criteria for a learning disability, but still are not at benchmark in terms of their fluency.
Yeah, I love that. And that is like speaking my love language. I love all of these multiple aspects of word knowledge because I think that's so lost in so many classrooms. And oftentimes we teach these sound symbol correspondences and focus on the P or maybe even the O with orthographic.
Yes, we always say the P and the
Yeah.
O is traditional to phonics instruction.
Yeah.
And hearing Melissa, when I first joined Crafty Minds, talk about the POSSUM approach, this multi-componential approach, this strategic fluency instruction. As a teacher who, mind you, I had my associate's certification in OG. I was well-versed in the phonics approach. And I think hearing Melissa talk about this, I realized there was this whole body of research that I wasn't privy to. And that bothered me because at the very heart of this instructional approach, you're tackling really both accuracy and automaticity. And you're giving students the opportunity to apply those skills to a targeted text. But the way we've created this routine, it is a nod to Dr. Wolf's work. We're giving them strategic practice at the letter sound level, at the single word, at the phrase, at the sentence level within a specific vocabulary routine. And that all comes directly from the connected text, because that's something else that was missing from my practice in OG. There was certainly some word lists, some phrasing, but I didn't always have time to get to the connected text. And we felt in our work with classroom teachers, that was often the feedback. And so to go back to really why we wrote that, it was to keep that text at the center, build the lesson backward using this POSSUM approach or this strategic fluency approach, so that when teachers taught the lesson in the reverse order, they're able to target all those components of word knowledge.
Yeah, that's so powerful. And then something else Dr. Wolf has been quoted saying is she talks about the attentional systems being like biological spotlights. And I find that fascinating. Can you just unpack that a bit for us?
Maryanne is really interested in deep reading. So deep reading would be considered the activation of like analysis. So, when we read, we can read in different ways. We can kind of skim a text, or we can activate areas of the brain that are like inferencing and activating like perspective taking and some of the empathy processes. But that doesn't happen casually. So what Maryanne points out in one of her books, so she has several books that she's written, and these books are really incredible tributes to our brains, our human brain. Her first book, Proust and the Squid, is about how we evolved as readers across the evolution of our species. And it's amazing and fascinating. And it talks about sort of the development really of written language, which is only about 7,000 years old to begin with, and how we've repurposed neurons to become readers when we're not born to do so. So that's amazing. And then in a more recent book, Reader Come Home, she talks about now in modern day, how reading has really changed, where when we read in ways that are more superficial or on devices that have so many different demands on our attention, we don't have the ability to engage in deeper reading. And the deeper reading is really what establishes critical thinking. It establishes our ability to analyze and to generate new ideas. Like we need that kind of moment to ponder, to connect, what we're reading to what we already know, and then to able to have an insight about the alignment between these two sources of information. When we have the demands of reading online and a text message comes in, or we think, oh my gosh, I have to buy that thing on that website. And it's so easy just to open up another tab and start shopping. It doesn't allow us the time to engage in these deep processes. And then connecting this all back to fluency, as many of us who work directly with children know, if a child is labored in their reading, in their word recognition, it impacts their comprehension. Not only are they not able to engage in the deeper processes, but they're struggling to even to hold on to the information that they're reading about because they're working so hard with the retrieval of the words that they see on the page. And so fluency is attention. These are all some of the really important cognitive skills and academic skills that support this deeper analysis, which is the goal in part of being a reader. We read faster than we can process auditory information. We read words at about 150 milliseconds. It's like instantaneous. So it's a huge contributor to our achievement as a species, reading. And when we have all of these different pulls on our attention, it's very hard to be able to use these skills in an effective way.
Yeah. So essentially, we can't learn if we're not attending to it. And just a side note, I remember coming towards this research, I guess it was post-COVID, where digital books were a necessity with online learning.
Yeah.
But essentially, it was saying when kids are reading off a screen, they're skimming and they're not truly reading. And I thought that was interesting too, because like you were saying, even just the attention of having a notification come up or having something else steal your attention, that all makes sense too. But even on myself, an article, I'm like, scroll, scroll, scroll. Move,
I know.
move.
Yeah. I think this is this is sort of a different conversation, but I think it's such an interesting topic, Michelle, because it also speaks to like the volume of information we have at our fingertips now. You're scrolling that article because there are 7 other articles that you want to read that are going to come through different Substacks or blogs, or someone's going to recommend something on one of your social media sites. And it's sort of overwhelming. Although I do think Sarah and I talk about this just as parents as well, creating habits of deep reading at home. Once your children have established a certain level of reading ability and they can read independently, being able to model and support that reading. And it can be on a Kindle. It's not like you have to read on an actual book, but it should be a time when you don't have access to other devices or the ability to search online, because it really is building a muscle, the ability to sustain attention for a period of time and give yourself the gift of being able to really focus on one particular text and think about it and ponder it. And that we try to do that in my house. We started at a very short period of time, like 5-10 minutes. My children are older. They're readers. They're 11 and 15, but they still don't have that muscle. And sometimes I don't have that muscle either. And I'm in my late 40s. And so I think that it is about incrementally building up that skill as well.
Definitely. And then maybe we can talk about how do we build fluency to get to this deep reading, and talk about your backwards planning approach, which I love, and how you guide teachers to start with this text and moving backwards with planning your lessons.
Yeah, it's funny, as you were using the word habit, right? Creating habits. I was also thinking good routines can also create habits. And going back to kind of the noise that as educators, I think we feel can be hard to stick with something. You're just as, you're on different podcasts, you're listening to different audiobooks, you're on Instagram with all these great influencers and people who have a wealth of knowledge. And I think my own challenge can sometimes be taking what I know to be true based off the research and sticking with it for a sustained amount of time. And I think there's always going to be something coming at us to say, oh, try this. And it's not to say we don't want to be mindful of that, but the routine piece was really important because it gives teachers and students predictable routines and activities that they're going to follow that build off one another. So to kind of back up, we really started by thinking about the phases of word recognition. And so again, there's the pre-alphabetic, which we're not necessarily talking about, but we mention it. So we're really working with kids who at the very first phase are thinking about the letters and their associated sounds. So matching up those letters and sounds. And even at this very basic level, we have a connected text, a decodable text. We've partnered with Phonic Books, DK Phonic Books. And so we take the connected text that targets, initial letter sounds. I think it's the SATPIN that they're working on, the letters SATPIN. Those have high utility for early blending. And we read the book. That's the first step. And from there, we pull out sentences. I use that term very loosely at this beginning phase because they're really 1 or 2 word sentences. Mm-hmm. But that forms the basis of the very end part of the routine. But from those sentences, we'll take out the single words, and those contain the taught patterns. And from there, we have an opportunity for students to blend those sounds. So there's a phonemic awareness activity. So if the word is sit, for example, right, or Tam sits, then the students would read the word sit, but prior to that, they would orally blend the sounds s, it, t, to pronounce the word sit, which is going to be what they're going to read. And then at that very basic level, there's an opportunity to think about the letter ID and the letter sound association. So again, rather than having every letter of the alphabet as part of the routine, we have really focused on the ones that are targeted in the text. And even at the very basic level, as a nod to POSSUM, we're including a vocabulary routine. So we could do something very basic as which one of these words is a name, right? Or which one of these words describes an action, right? And it might be sit. So we're having kids think about not only what the letters and sounds that make up that word to blend and pronounce it, but what does that word mean? How is it used in a sentence, even at that very basic level? So each chapter focuses on a different phase of word recognition. And we also included case studies because, again, working with lots of different teachers, lots of different districts, we wanted to have teachers have kind of an anchor to think about, yes, Cameron sounds a lot like some of my kindergartners. I know students just like Cameron, for example, or Mateo, who are having difficulty. So from there, each chapter focuses on winning strategies. So I mentioned in chapter 1, we're highlighting continuous blending. So there's certainly support in having students take the traditional approach of segmenting sound. So if they're thinking about s, it, some kids are able to take that approach and internalize it. And then when they come to the word sit, they can read it. Other kids we found have a difficult time potentially for working memory challenges, phonological challenges. And when they come to the word like sit and they say those individual sounds, s, it, right? What happens? A lot of kids might say tis or pat. And we're left wondering, like, what's happening? So rather than continue at the segmentation approach, the thought is, well, what is supported, in the research? How can we give teachers just a little twist, just a little something else to try that's going to boost kids into that ability to then blend? Because once kids can blend, they can access more text. Once they're reading more text, they can map those words. And so that process is repeated for each of the chapters. Chapter 2 utilizes a different decodable text, but the idea is still the same. So we take the book, we pull out 3 sentences from the text that contain the targeted pattern. We pull out the phrases for the RAND chart or the single word for the RAND chart. Then there's single words. Then there's a phonemic awareness. And then as we kind of progress, there's an opportunity to do a dictation activity as well to make sure that students are then spelling the same words that they're going to be reading.
I love that kind of approach. And I think that really sets students up to be really successful when it comes to the connected text, because you can have this idea of, we're going to learn about digraphs and just read some random words with CH, and then just so happen to pick up a passage that potentially has a slew of CH words. But here you're setting students up to be successful with the text from the forefront by pulling the sentences out and pulling the phrases out and then pulling
exactly. And Michelle, a lot of kids, there are kids who, if you're teaching your tier 1 phonics and you have a associated decodable text that goes with it, they can apply what they've learned and they can read that text with accuracy and automaticity. But again, we're thinking about those students who are at risk for reading difficulties or who maybe need additional differentiation and support. And that's really what these lessons are intended to do. For some kids, the decodable, you take it, it's easy, but we're trying to give teachers a routine to bridge. How do I get to the end result, that end goal of reading the text? What are the routines that I can have my students participate in or that I can explicitly teach my students so that they then can have success to apply those skills? And that this formula has worked very nicely, again, in my private practice that I've worked with students, in my own child, but really with the teachers that we're supporting. And so we've gotten a lot of feedback and been able to tweak, take in their suggestions along the way to create these routines that not only build on each other, but along the way provide differentiated aspects that they can employ into the different routines from previous chapters, so to speak.
Yeah. And it's truly a fluency buildup. And then when you organize your chapters, you talked about how you have them organized by the phases of reading. There's a slight shift. You have this midway point between Aries full alphabetic, where students are really tapping into that sound by sound decoding. And then there's the consolidated alphabetic, where we're hoping orthographic mapping is kicking in. But you have this halfway point between these two phases to have like a stepping stone in order to get to that orthographic mapping. And while that's not part of Aries' original theory, can you walk us through your thinking there in including that and how some of the routines really support this transitional time?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that what we saw when we were in the field and in our own practices, Sarah as a classroom teacher and a coach, and myself at the clinic, is that this was a real sticking point for students. As Sarah said, for some students, they can sound out words one sound at a time, recode it, and then eventually drop that sound by sound reading. But there are many, many children that kind of hold on, white knuckle, that sound by sound reading and won't release the tapping out each sound. And we wanted to give students a strategy that would be supportive of eventually just being able to see the word and saying it. So for example, going from sounding out a word like blast, b-l-a-s-t, and recoding it blast, to just seeing the word and saying blast. And so Maryanne, in her work in Ravo, had done a number of sort of research studies and also just kind of collecting empirical support for using rhyme patterns. And rhyme pattern work in the field is thought of as analytic phonics. And there was some kind of review of the findings on studies that used analytic phonics in the National Reading Panel, which was convened all the way back in 2000. And essentially the findings substantiated that analytic phonics can work just as well as synthetic phonics, but that we don't want to use it in the absence of synthetic phonics. So synthetic phonics is where you're teaching each individual sound symbol correspondence, and you're ensuring that children know that before they combine it into a word family. So that is always going to be important. You wouldn't just teach word families. However, the rhyme has some secret powers inside of it. So the rhyme pattern of a word is the vowel and what follows. And it's really thought of as one of the largest and most consistent units in a word. So largest because it's more than one letter. It's usually a chunk of letters, the vowel and everything that follows. And consistent because the pronunciation of a vowel in a word is actually governed by the letters that follow it, not the letters that precede it. So for example, Michelle, if I tell you to pronounce the word G-O, how would you pronounce that word?
Go.
And how did you know to say it that way?
O is the open syllable, long vowel sound.
Amazing. And then if I gave you the word G-O-T, how would you pronounce that word?
Got.
Now, how did you know how to pronounce the vowel sound in that word?
Closed in by the consonant.
Yeah. And then finally, Michelle, if I gave you the word G-O-A-T, how would you pronounce that word?
Goat.
And again, how'd you know how to pronounce the vowel sound there?
We have a vowel team working.
Exactly. So you're not looking at the G, you're looking at what follows the O. And so what follows the letters is what governs the pronunciation. So being able to quickly recognize these rhyme patterns not only supports a pronunciation of a larger chunk of the word, but also helps stabilize the pronunciation of the vowel. And then in addition, English words tend to kind of replicate these rhyme patterns. That's why word families work. Because if I say, think of all the words you can with the rhyme pattern at, or the rhyme pattern ill, or the rhyme pattern ite, you would be able to generate quite a number of words because we tend to see these rhyme patterns frequently throughout our language, and they're easier for us to retrieve when we know a rhyme pattern. So if you're someone who plays Wordle, which I really enjoy playing, I have the easiest time thinking of a word in Wordle when I've been able to figure out the rhyme pattern or when I've been able to figure out the starter sound. And that's not by coincidence. David Kilpatrick has written about this. In our auditory memory, we store words by certain sound cues. One cue that we use to store words is the starter sound. So if I said, think of as many words as you can that start with the sound I'll give you 30 seconds, you would start writing furiously. Like that would be really easy for you because we store words by the initial sound or the starter sound. Another way that we tend to store words is by the rhyme pattern. So if I said, think of as many words as you can that have the rhyme pattern at, that would be really easy for you. You would start thinking of words. We do not store words by vowel sound in isolation. It's too complex to store words by vowel sound in isolation. So if I said to you, Michelle, think of as many words as you can that have the vowel sound ah, but don't make them rhyme family words, that would take you longer because you'd be like, okay, well, what word? Let's see, got, and let's see, shot. No, I can't do rhyme families. So it would take you quite a bit of time. And so by teaching rhyme patterns or using that as a strategy to support word recognition, we're using all of these different underlying processes, the way we store the word, the way orthography works in English, the commonality of rhyme patterns, the fact that it's a chunk. We're using those to our advantage to help move along the process.
And Melissa, you did an awesome job always explaining that. So I always appreciate when you do that. And it's very important to note that this is a temporary scaffold. I don't want anyone to walk away saying, Melissa Orkin, Sarah Gannon, Alex Osborne, they're telling teachers that the only way to teach word recognition or decoding is by reading by rhyme pattern. But this is for a very specific student who is, as Melissa mentioned, stuck in that sound by sound tapping phase or having a hard time mapping words. So we first start by teaching the student, well, what is a rhyme pattern? How do you recognize a rhyme pattern? And so that's outlined in the book with a nice script. And then from there, when students are working at the single word level, again, if the word is, let's say it's shot, they maybe in past would say shot. Shot. What we're asking them to do is to find the rhyme pattern. You're right. That's where the O is. Now read the rhyme pattern. Ought. Put on the start or read the starter. Sh. What's the word blend? Shot. And then eventually students can go to ought, shot. So we're sort of reducing that scaffold of cueing for the starter sound or the onset. And by and large, students begin to internalize. So it's a very specific strategy for a very specific student, and it's definitely temporary. And I think that's really important to communicate that we're trying to think about where the students are in their word reading, where they need to go, and what's the bridge or what are the strategies we need to practice to move them along.
And what you just demonstrated too, you reference as backwards decoding in your book as well, right?
Exactly. Yep.
And I appreciate you speaking to the nuance in all of this because we can get lost in science of reading conversations about this or that and black and white judgment calls around things. And we'll see conversations about synthetic phonics versus analytic phonics. And when you look at the research on the whole, synthetic phonics tends to be the approach that is going to be most beneficial for our students, starting with the sound by sound. And what you're saying is we're not starting with the rhyme. We're not teaching kindergartners from the rhyme from the get-go. You're utilizing the analytic phonics at a later point as a strategy for students who are stuck in that sound by sound approach. And I think that's an important distinction when we're thinking about this bigger conversation, that this is for a particular student in mind to transition them from that sound by sound decoding to a more unitization. And Sarah, I saw you at the Reading League too in Chicago this past summer, and we had David Scher as the keynote speaker, and he was talking about his combinatorial model, which is a mouthful to say, but all about that unitization. And essentially, we want to unitize things in the brain as well. And of course, we're taking every letter string into consideration, every sound into consideration. But for that efficiency for orthographic mapping to occur, there has to be this unitization where we're seeing these larger chunks, and how, Melissa, you were just saying that everything preceding that vowel sound is a more consistent unit of pronunciation.
You're exactly right. And it's thinking about the diagnostic piece of structured literacy as well. And that's really all we're attempting to show is where's the student, what do they know, what are we going to teach them, and then we're going to monitor the progress for a sustained amount of time based on what we know, 8 to 10 week interval, and then we're going to look at what our data shows, and then we're going to make adjustments. I think if we take this strategic approach, it allows you to be diagnostic, but it also allows you, as you said, the little nuances that go into teaching reading. If reading were black and white, you wouldn't be having this podcast, right? We have to honor the layers.
Literacy in color. Not black and white.
Great name. I think it's the nuances of teaching reading, and that's what always keeps me coming back and excites me, because I don't pretend as a classroom teacher or practitioner to have all the answers. I can pull my experience. I can meet with like-minded individuals, but I also need to be open in my practice to hearing, that's an interesting way to think about it. Let me try it for a sustained amount of time. I like to use that because sometimes, again, that information overload, it's very easy to one day do this, one day do a word list, one day do backward decoding, one day go back to sound by sound blending. And it is important to have an approach that you're sticking with, that you're monitoring progress, and that you're being consistent with.
And to give students a chance to be successful before we jump the gun to the next shiny object in front of us.
Exactly. So true.
So reading by rhyme is just one of your high leverage winning strategies. I love this whole playbook analogy that you share in your book. Can you share some of the other high leverage routines that you include?
We're trying to teach across the POSSUM elements. So obviously the phonology and orthography, in part, we do some phonemic awareness activities, but brief. And we do focus on blending and segmenting for the most part, blending before reading, segmenting before spelling, because blending supports the sequencing of sounds and segmenting supports the breaking up of sounds. And we have, for the semantics piece, we do a lot of vocabulary work. So as Sarah said early on, we'll just be providing some guided questions for students around some of the words. So let's imagine they just read a list of words that include like sat or tam. And we will ask which word means the opposite of stand. Which word is the name of a character in the story? So just to make those connections. And then as we progress into more complex phases of word recognition, we begin to work with the meanings of words. We focus in on words that have multiple meanings. A significant proportion of words in English have multiple meanings. These are words like stick or track. And these words are fantastic for really building students' depth of word knowledge. So sometimes when we think of vocabulary, we just think of how many words do we know, but we also want to think about how much do you know about each word. And there's been a whole body of research that has demonstrated the importance of word associations in the speed of word recognition. So words that have more associations or more connections are more quickly recognized during reading. And so we do a lot of work in our lessons to build out those associations, whether it's providing definitions for the multiple meanings in sentences, but also really eliciting students' connections to a word. So for example, with a word like stick, you might ask a student, where might you find sticks? And what activities can you do with sticks when you're camping? Or why do you need to stick wrapping paper to a present? Why would you use tape instead of a nail to stick something? So really kind of building out all of these connections and deepening their associations with words. So those are our semantic routines. We have syntactic routines that we use. So syntax. So sometimes we can feel the energy in the room drop when we bring up syntax, because grammar does not elicit the enthusiasm that maybe other areas of word knowledge do. But grammar is so powerful at helping students with prosody when they're reading. So being able to recognize how words can be grouped together in a phrase and then being able to read a sentence in phrases is so fantastic. So for example, if the sentence is something like, the man got out of the car, some students might read it, the man got out of the car, which is zero prosody, or they might read it, the man got out of the car, which is no phrasing at all. Whereas if you can show the students and teach them about nouns and verbs and the subject phrase and the predicate or action phrase, and then the students would be able to read, the man got out of the car. And we connect the reading of sentences and phrases to supporting students' comprehension. Because immediately after they read that sentence in our lesson, we will ask a student, who or what was that sentence about? The man. What did the man do? He got out. What did he get out of? That's a pretty simple sentence. But as the sentences begin to become more complex, and there might be a prepositional phrase at the beginning of the sentence. So in the dark of night, the man got out of the car, then that will provide more information for the students to organize and process, and being able to break it up into these meaningful phrases helps to scaffold that whole cognitive demand for the students. So syntax is another winning strategy, syntactic phrasing, we call it. And then as Sarah mentioned, we also use something called a RAN chart. So a RAN chart, RAN stands for rapid automatic naming, and RAN is deeply tied to retrieval. So one of the ways that we can measure students' retrieval cognitively is by administering a RAN task. Usually these are part of something like a neuropsychological evaluation. A RAN task is a set of maybe 5 letters or 5 numbers or even 5 objects for younger children. And what the task is doing is it's repeatedly presenting these objects in a different array or a different sequence. So it would be something like book, star, dog, chair, hand, star, book, chair, dog, that sort of thing. What a RAN task is doing is it's measuring the speed with which an individual can name the label of a symbol. So that pairing of a verbal label and a symbol is very predictive of the rate of retrieval that a student will likely have when they're engaging in fluent reading. If that rate is very slow, the child is likely to encounter challenges in becoming a fluent reader. And this measure of RAN or retrieval is universally the most predictive measure of reading ability, far more predictive than phonemic awareness across all types of alphabetic systems. So it's a really important measure to have as part of a neuropsychological evaluation. That being said, in her work in her RAVO curriculum, Maryanne, she didn't want to have RAN charts in there that are associated with a neuropsychological evaluation because there's no real value in quickly naming letters or quickly naming objects. However, if you are working on a particular word in your lesson, being able to repeatedly present that to a student in the format of a RAN chart, which means that the student's reading across a line of text from left to right, then they're engaging in what's called the return sweep, where the eye has to track across the line and go down to the next line, stay in order and then read across that. There is value in having this repeated practice of retrieving the word as a whole unit, not decoding it, and alternating between different types of words. So we introduce these charts a little later in our book as one routine that can be used in a lesson when you're trying to build that orthographic mapping. So you've read the word, maybe you've done some work with the rhyme pattern, you've sounded it out. Now we want you to see the word and say it. So we use RAN charts to support the individual word retrieval. And then we also have some phrases in RAN charts. So we'll have maybe 3 or 4 phrases that we repeatedly present in a chart. And it gives students, again, a chance to then retrieve that larger chunk that also taps into their syntactic knowledge. And then we have some winning strategies around comprehension and spelling as well. But this gives you a sense of how sometimes when we're thinking about structured literacy, we focus very heavily on the P and the O, but bringing in the S's and the M, we didn't even get a chance to talk about morphology, but we do have strategies for that as well, is really going to round out connections between all the aspects of the reading circuit, especially between the language, oral language and written language, and support overall fluency.
Yeah. And I know you were joking about that syntax, but I love a good syntax activity.
Oh, good.
That phrase,
Yeah.
like phrase cued reading, it's like you're setting students up to read in the meaningful phrases. And oftentimes when we provide connected text for the first time and just say read in phrases, then the phrases can be awkward. But if we're thinking about those WH questions and reading for purpose, that all supports fluency and comprehensions.
Definitely.
And certainly there's one practice teachers might engage in is choral reading or echo reading. And, certainly I think that has its place, but when we're pulling out the sentences and asking teachers to provide an actual scoop underneath the phrasing, we're providing that visual support for students to be able to track that phrase, read it, either whisper read or read it in their head first, and then read it chorally. And that's the other part of the book that really highlights sort of the differing in approaches that I think I was privy to, or what I was using in my classroom, where if I pulled a small group, and again, most teachers are pulling 3, 4, 5, maybe even 6 students in these groups. And I would have each student take a turn to read a word, or each student take a turn to read a sentence, because in my mind, I wanted to see what that student can do. But we're, drawing on the work from Anita Archer and really being strategic in our ability to have everyone respond. And so we talk a lot about that in the book as well, to maximize student practice, to maximize student participation, because sometimes you only have 15 or 20 minutes to run a small group. And rather than have everybody take their individual turns, we can have everybody do everything. Except in a vocabulary routine, we talk about having students be divided into pairs, and maybe you're peanut butter and Melissa is jelly. And I'm going to ask the peanut butter folks to talk about, their word associations with the word bat first, and Melissa would listen, and then we would switch. So again, rather than having individual responses or having everybody respond, we're breaking that down and giving students a bit more time to listen and respond to their partner. So I think that's another part of the book that was very integral in helping to move practice for students, give them that opportunity to do all of the work, because in practice is where that progress happens.
And one of the things I liked about when you do a choral reading response, you do give students a moment to read it in their heads too. So it's not just that they're scaffolded by the group if they don't get it, but you give them that wait time to tackle it on their own before we bring it to the group. So I thought that was a really great strategy as well.
It's so critical, because there's students who will quickly catch on to the end and they look like they're reading, but you really can't always tell. And so it can be challenging, students who have difficulty waiting their turn, but the way we do it and the way we practice it and giving lots of positive feedback, by and large, it works for most students to be able to just wait that. It's just a half a second.
Yeah, we have lots of teacher scripts in the book, because we know that these are changes for some teachers in teaching, whether it's about the rhyme pattern piece or about the syntax. So for myself, I know as an educator, I would always think like, what am I going to say here? How am I going to introduce this? And that people have been thinking about this for a long time. That should not be something that teachers have to figure out so much. We want to take that burden off your plate. So we have a lot of suggested scripts that just give a starting point for educators, whether you're teaching this as a tutorial, if you're maybe in private practice, or you're working in a school, or maybe you're a para, and this is your first time really providing any kind of reading support, and maybe you haven't had extensive training. We wanted to make it really accessible for anyone to start using these strategies with their students. So each chapter has a lesson in it, and the lessons and the books are available digitally for free. The book has all sorts of QR codes where you can access all of that, so that anyone at any point could start just trying these things out. They don't even have to have the actual book, in their library in order to teach these lessons.
Wonderful. And then in the beginning, you talked about students with dyslexia, and as you were talking about your RAND protocol, which essentially is like a fluency grid too,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
You talked about this importance of retrieval. And I think oftentimes when we think dyslexia, we think like phonological core deficit. phonological processing. But can you speak more? Sometimes when students have this retrieval issue, we also call it like a double deficit dyslexia. Like,
Yeah.
how do these particular routines support both phonological processing and retrieval, and how you are strategic with those?
Yeah, so we think of dyslexia as being kind of an umbrella term. More and more, we are seeing these subtypes of dyslexia. And to be honest, we don't have a full understanding yet of all of the subtypes, but some of the subtypes that have been consistently found have to do with where, as you said, like the sort of the challenges lie in the student's processing. So some students, as you said, Michelle, have difficulty with the phonological piece. And so by looking at an evaluation report, you'll notice that those students have trouble with their phonemic awareness performance or their decoding measures. And so we think of that as being sort of in that correspondence between letter and sound. And other students have difficulty with the fluency piece. So they might actually have quite a body of skills in terms of their accuracy abilities, but it's very slow. And so it impedes their ability to really hold on to the information as they're reading because they don't have the automaticity, they don't have the fluency. And we think of those children as having what we call being part of the naming speed subtype. And then there is a proportion of students who meet the characteristics for both subtypes. So that's both the phonological subtype and the naming speed subtype. So they have difficulties with both accuracy and fluency. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to create an approach that would really support both the accuracy through the P and the O, the phonology and the orthography. And then the fluency piece is using particular strategies that are going to make the orthography piece as efficient as possible. So for example, we talked about the recognition of the rhyme pattern. In earlier stages of word recognition, we use continuous blending. So rather than teaching students every letter, name, and letter sound, as Sarah said, we chose a handful of letters. SAT-PIN is a good way to remember the letters, SATPIN. Those tend to be the most utilitarian in building the widest number of words. So if they know the sounds of those letters, they can start blending words and we can show them the continuous blending strategy. So that's where we don't break up the sounds, we connect them. So it would be like a sat, so that there's that connectivity. And there's some research that was done in 2020 by Gonzalez Fry and Linnea Airy that showed that that was more effective with children at those early stages of word recognition than the segmenting and recoding approach. So we're trying to address both. Now, that being said, some children who need more accuracy support, we have a very limited number of repetitions because if you have a lesson that's 20 minutes and you're trying to do an activity on semantics, an activity on syntax, an activity on orthography, you have to have a limited number of repetitions for each of those different types of activities. So what a teacher might find is that if their student really struggles with accuracy, they might need to increase the number of repetitions of sound symbol correspondence or single word reading or for dictations. But the basis, the kind of underlying foundational framework is there, and then teachers can differentiate the nature of the intensity based on the student sitting in front of them.
Yeah. And then when you think about the teachers that you had in mind as you were writing this book, who do you envision using this resource the most? Is it the classroom teacher for whole class instruction, for small class instruction, intervention work?
For the majority of teachers, this would be helpful if you're a classroom teacher and providing small group instruction. It's certainly been used by interventionists across districts that we've worked with. As Melissa mentioned earlier, paras are able to take this routine and integrate it. Having the scripts can be particularly helpful. So it's really supporting students who require additional practice in that small group setting. But again, we've had special educators who have taken maybe like a Wilson passage and utilized this backward planning approach to give a bit more strategic instruction in that fluency aspect. So it really can be used pretty broadly. It's for kids who are reading in that K-2 band for the most part. And I say that you may have older students who would benefit from this approach, but it's really thinking about the type of phonics concepts and such that the different decoding phases that students are in. So
yeah, it goes through multisyllabic words as well. Yeah, I agree, Sarah. I think what we found is that teachers who have used the book have started out using it with small groups. And then they've said, oh, you know what? I think this strategy actually would be helpful to show my whole class. So I'm going to proceed with my tier 1 instruction, but I'm going to differentiate it by bringing in this strategy. Or as Sarah said, I'm a special educator. I'm teaching a specialized reading program, an Orkin-Gillingham program, but I found that my students are not becoming fluent as they're going through the Orkin-Gillingham program. So when we're doing single word reading, I'm going to show them this strategy. Or I don't have a vocabulary routine in my Orkin-Gillingham program, or I don't do syntactic phrasing in my Orkin-Gillingham program. So I'm going to bring that in. So I think it can provide both a lesson and or a strategy that you can use given whatever material you have in front of you.
Yeah, I'm glad, Melissa, you mentioned that, because as we said at the very beginning, we utilized certain series and certain decodable texts. But the idea is, if you don't have access, although again, there's a free component, you can download the 2 different books per chapter, you can download the lesson plan. But the idea is you can use any decodable text in your library. You can use decodable text from our game plan generator that we have online available. And the idea is to take whatever it is your student's working on in terms of that phonics concept and utilize the routine or the lesson plan. And so the purpose is to give the teacher options and to give the teacher different ways into that lesson planning, not necessarily have to use it lockstep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's helpful. And I think even just thinking about that acronym POSSUM from the beginning too, and looking at your routines and how you have them laid out and thinking about what's lacking from your instruction that you can bring in as well. And especially that meaning component, because gosh, we could just be reading nonsense words. Otherwise, if we're not bringing meaning in.
Right. Yeah. And Sarah had this genius idea, when we were developing this book, she said, well, what if teachers wanted to create a lesson instantaneously that followed this framework? And so she has worked really closely with some software developers to create a tool on our website that allows teachers to backwards plan a routine from a text given a particular skill that they're working on. So a teacher can go on to what's called, because these are called game plans in the book. So this tool on our website is called the Game Plan Generator. And this is all very foreign to me because I'm not a sports person. Anyway, so
I strong-armed her into it.
Yeah. I'm like, what is this winning strategy?
I love a theme.
Yeah.
We do love a theme. We're teachers.
This time it's going to have to be like the masterpiece. And but anyway. So teachers can go on, they can say, I'm working with a child who's reading at a, first grade level, and they are working on vowel consonant E, or they're working on blends, or they're working on R-controlled vowels. And they can select this skill and it will generate a story for them. So it always starts with the story, backwards planning. And then they can edit that story. So they could include like the student's name, or they could include, additional words or what have you. And then from the story, it will pull out the vocabulary word, and it will generate a kid-friendly definition of the vocabulary word. It will generate questions for you. If it's a Frere model, it will do examples and non-examples. If it's a multiple meaning word, it will generate the multiple meanings. You get to choose images that represent each of the meanings. It will generate trick words, word lists, and then it will populate it all into slide decks so that you can use each slide to teach from, and then you can print out the story and things like that. So if that's something that's of interest to your listeners, we can give you the link, and folks can go on and just try it out to start. There is like a nominal monthly fee, but we wanted to make it really accessible for teachers. And we hope that that's a tool that folks can use regardless of what resources they have in their own, library.
That's amazing. So it's not phonics games, it's a game plan.
It's a game plan and teaching material. Yeah.
Amazing. That sounds incredible. And what a time saver for teachers. It's lovely to backwards plan and do this work on your own, but to have the help of technology to save you time, put it in action, I think is such a gift. So that's amazing that you have that. And we'll definitely link it in the show notes.
Thank you.
Then as for all of the other work that you do, maybe you can just share where listeners can connect with you further and find out more about your book and maybe some of your other offerings.
We have a website, and we have found that folks have enjoyed taking courses from us on the website. Our courses are both self-guided and virtual live courses. We do training in the RAVO program as well. So if that is of interest to you as a Tier 3 specialized program for individuals with dyslexia, we have information about that. We have the game plan generator, and we have some additional resources that we've developed. We're also big fans of morphology. I know, Michelle, you have a lot of resources on morphology. We also have a resource for students in upper grades in morphology. So really starting in like 4th through 6th grade.
And they're beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So how do you continue to build skills at those upper grade levels? And we combine the morphology with informational text so that students are really able to challenge themselves, in terms of their comprehension, learning about new information. So those are all on our website, craftingmindsgroup.com.
Wonderful. We'll link it all. And thank you again for joining me on the show today. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you and hearing all of your insights in how you constructed this book and the intentional routines that you included to support all types of learners. I think is such a gift. And congratulations again on putting this book in the world.
Thank you, Michelle. Thanks for your dedication to the field. We appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much for tuning into Literacy in Color. I hope today's episode left you feeling both inspired and equipped with something new to add to your teaching toolkit. If you're enjoying this podcast, it would truly mean so much to me if you'd leave a 5-star review. It helps other educators find the show and join our colorful community. And don't forget to hit the follow or subscribe button so you never miss an episode. For more tips, tools, and resources, be sure to check out the links in the show notes at michelleandthecolorfulclassroom.com. Thanks again for listening, and I'll catch you next week. Until then, be colorful and teach colorfully.